How are you doing?
I'm doing splendidly for an old man. I'm doing splendidly for anybody, but particularly for an old man.
Yeah, we were so happy that you accepted because it's just amazing how many different adventures you've had. I'm really looking forward to hearing about them. I don't know if you wanted to give a short introduction on yourself, or I mean, I saw from your website you have 5 circumnavigations and 7 books, and possibly like the world record to this day on distance in an open boat, which was really amazing to me. Which of your different adventures, which ones would you list as the top ones, or which do you feel were the most difficult to accomplish?
Of the 5+ circumnavigations, because I'm sitting here in Evanston, surrounded by the land. My boat is in New Zealand, and I'm on my 6th circumnavigation, and would be back there in a couple of months, getting the boat ready to sail on. Of the 5 circumnavigations, the first, the second, and frankly, the 6th are the most difficult. On the first, I sailed an engineless 37-foot cutter from San Diego around the world in 2 stops. Was the first American to go alone around Cape Horn. And while it's a little difficult to think back then going around Cape Horn was really rare. It is still alone. It is still considerably rarer than climbing Everest, because you can pay people to partially haul you to the top of Everest. You can't pay anybody to sail you alone around Cape Horn. That was 40 years ago last month that I was off the Horn. I was off the Horn then in force 12, hurricane force conditions. After I did that voyage, I set what was then the record for the fastest solo circumnavigation in a monohull. I'm the one who broke Sir Francis Chichester's record. He went around, off the top of my mind, in 226 days in a 53-foot boat. I went around in 203 days in a 37-foot boat. After that, I was looking for for a year, I was happy to be back in the United States, in San Diego, with the woman who was then a part of my life. But after about a year, I started to want a new challenge. And I wanted something that was qualitatively different, and also it's always been important to me that boats not cost very much. I have never had a boat that cost more than a mid-price car, and they've all been stock boats. Anyway, I decided to try to sail around the world in an open boat, an 18-foot Drascombe lugger. They're built in England, and they had made the longest open boat passages up to that time, but nobody had ever tried to sail around the world in one. I made it most of the way around from San Diego. That voyage ended in the Canary Islands, actually with the second of my open boats, because the first one ended up in Saudi Arabia, where they locked me up as a spy for a while. Those 2 were more difficult than the 3rd and the 4th, even though I went around Cape Horn again on the 3rd, but I did that with the woman who was then a part of my life, which is a phrase I use often, because I've been married, at the moment I've been married more times than I've circumnavigated, but I'm going to even that up with this voyage. The present voyage is, again, I'm attempting to do something that's not been done before. Perhaps that needs to be explained, because the reason I'm not really trying to do things that, particularly because they haven't been done before, but I try to solve problems that interest me, and often those seem to be things that nobody else has tried to do before. I'm sailing a 24-foot ultralight displacement boat, a Moored 4, which are great boats. This boat is almost 40 years old. They were the first of the ultralight class built in the United States back in the 70s, and late 70s, early 80s. They're still raced successfully in the single and double-handed races from California to Hawaii. And as a matter of fact, one of them won its class in the last single-handed race 2 years ago. Another won its class in the double-handed race last year. But nobody's ever tried to go beyond Hawaii in one. In 2014, I sailed across the Pacific, and I damaged my shoulder late that year, and the boat is in Opua, New Zealand, which is the Bay of Islands and one of my favorite places in the world. And so I did not move on last year, 2015, but I've already sailed that boat farther than anyone else has ever sailed that kind of a boat, and this year I will add another 10,000 miles if all goes well, and by the end of the year be in South Africa.
Yeah, those are just some amazing accomplishments. I was wondering, do you have any particular advice for people that are looking to do incredible things like this in life, or do you think that there's anything different about you? At some point, did you decide? I know you got into sailing kind of you were sailing in your 20s, but it wasn't until your 30s that you really started these intense circumnavigations and records. Was there something that kind of changed in your mind, or you just have always been this way? And it's also incredible that now, in your 70s, you're doing another circumnavigation. Do you feel there's just something innately different about you, or did you change your mind at some point and develop a different life philosophy?
You force me into a modesty, but yeah, there's something different about me. When people are young, they often will read books about what people have done in the past, and I always thought that I was capable of doing that. Maybe lots of people think they're capable of doing it, and the difference is you either prove it or you don't. One of my own lines is that I'm not really just a sailor, and I'm not even a sailor first. I call myself an artist. One of my own lines is that a sailor is an artist whose medium is the wind. Those words are probably going to be remembered longer than anything else I ever wrote. So you reduce 74 years down to, what, 6 or 8 words. Another is that an artist's responsibility, defining responsibility, is to go to the edge of human experience and send back reports, and that's my job. And it's not a job from which I retire. If my body or brain give up, then they'll retire me. But that's what I've done. That's what I've always done. I grew up. Sitting here in a condo looking out at snow in Evanston, Illinois, because my wife's career is here. I grew up in a suburb of St. Louis, and I didn't really like it there. And as a young boy, I read books, and fortunately, a good stroke of chance was that my grandparents, with whom I was close, retired to a beach house in San Diego when I was a teenager, and I spent my summers out there. And so I always wanted to do what I've done with my life. Nobody in my family ever sailed, and so I bought my first boat when I was 25 years old, and in Oakland, California. I left on my first voyage when I was 33, I believe. It took me that long to save the money and to have enough to go my own way. In one of your earlier emails, you said there was some interest in my funding. Well, my funding is me. I don't believe in, there's no sponsorship money in America particularly. There's a lot in France and some in England and some other places. But I've never sought sponsors. I've paid my own way. As I say, I have never had expensive boats. The most expensive boat I had cost maybe $35,000. That was $35,000 in 19, so more now. But I decided a long time. I worked just enough out of college in order to leave. When I left, I had a 5-year plan to leave when I left on my first circumnavigation, and I left to the day. I was living in San Diego, where the weather's predictable, and you can say you're going to leave at a certain time and probably be right because the weather's going to be nice. But I chose back then to be independently poor, and the key word is the independent. So that's what I've done.
What were some of the challenges of being on an open 18-foot boat? I just can't imagine in a storm, for example. How do you even keep bailed out or keep from getting hypothermia?
Well, most of that voyage was made in warm waters, but you still get cold. There was a small bilge pump. It was a centerboard boat. There was a bilge pump built into the aft end, a hand bilge pump built into the aft end of the centerboard trunk. I slept on the floorboards on a foam mattress, thin foam mattress. One side was regular foam, the other side was closed cell foam, so that I wouldn't be at sea sleeping on sponge. I was in storms I was in gale force storms, one around Tahiti that blew 55 knots recorded on the land. In that storm, I was 6 miles from making it into Papeete, and it took me, when the storm came up and I was blown all the way around the island, which is about 40 miles long, it took me 4 days to cover those, to in essence cover what would have been 6 miles, although I sailed all the way around the island to get in. Once the boat was pitch bowled and was swamped, it had flotation built into it so that it wouldn't sink, but it was filled up to the gunwale in water, and that was between Fiji and what is now Vanuatu. Back then it was the New Hebrides. And I pumped up the inflatable and drifted for 2 weeks, living on 6 sips of water and a half a can of tuna fish a day before I reached land by myself. And it was difficult, but it was a good and an interesting challenge.
It was. I think Lauren just had some problem with the connection, so hopefully we'll come online soon. I wanted to ask you, what are some of the places that you visited in your trips around the world that stayed more in your heart, that you were more...
Yeah, the easy answer to that is New Zealand. Australia too, to an extent, but I like the Southern Hemisphere generally. There are most of the people in the world and most of the problems are up here in the Northern Hemisphere. And but I like New Zealand very much. I sailed in there 40 years ago, for the first time 40 years ago, next March. I have sailed back many times. I kept my last boat there. I owned a mooring in the Bay of Islands, which is about 120 miles north of Auckland. And it's a country the size of California physically about, but with only 4.5 million people, and 1.5 million of them around Auckland. And it's a beautiful countryside. It's a great place for a boat. There are all kinds of anchorages and harbors. Up in the north, in the Bay of Islands, it is temperate. It's the climate is kind of like mid-California, say San Luis Obispo or Monterey. It never freezes in the winter. There's a lot of rain, but it comes and goes. And so I like New Zealand very much. I have spent a lot of time in Brazil, or excuse me, I have spent time in Brazil, but I've spent a lot of time in Australia, several years, a couple of years at different times in Sydney, which is a wonderful city. I have spent probably a year or two. I've sailed into South Africa at least 3 times, and I will be back there by the end of this year if all goes well. So I like the Southern Hemisphere. I like the South Pacific. I like the islands less than I used to, the tropics. I now like more temperate climates. I've sailed to French Polynesia 7 times, and 2 of the most beautiful islands in the world are in French Polynesia, in my opinion, Moorea and Bora Bora. The third is an island that I think is one of the most beautiful, is an island called Lord Howe Island, which is Australian and about 400 miles northeast of Sydney out in the Tasman. I like the water in the tropics, but again, I like more temperate climates than I used to. And as a matter of fact, I paid the price just before I came on the air. I got a call from my skin doctor who removed something from me a few weeks ago. I get skin cancers removed from time to time, and I'm going to have to go back tomorrow to have a little bit more of me chipped away, which is one of the long-term gifts of spending too much time in the tropics.
I'm sorry, my internet connection. We're having a El Nino storm here, and I've got wireless internet that gets affected by that on rare occasions. Sorry about that.
Where are you, Lauren? Excuse me. Where are you physically?
In Los Angeles.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So I've been fortunate to live here as well and get into more frequent sailing. I grew up on Chesapeake Bay, and luckily my parents sailed, so I kind of had a head start, which was also interesting to me that you got into sailing later, and yet were able to accomplish more than almost everyone else. I didn't hear your. Did you answer about the open boat and the particular challenges of being in an open boat? What you did during storms, how you avoid hypothermia? I don't know if I cut off before I even got to ask that question.
I think I answered the question. I answered it. I certainly gave an answer. Whether all the information, I don't know.
That is the recording.
And what were some of your other biggest challenges with all the different boats and circumnavigations? What would you list as your top 2 or 3 difficult situations or challenges or lessons learned?
Well, I don't know about lessons learned. Seamanship is common sense and experience, and the common sense is most important. It also helps to have a good body. And I maybe was lucky in terms of genes, although my mother was not a physical person. People go to sea, and I see people who are engaged in perhaps more conventional cruising. And they spend a lot of money on their boats, they spend a lot of money on equipment preparing them, and they don't prepare themselves. At times, it's going to get physical out there, and I have kept myself in shape, and as I say, maybe I'm lucky in that it's not so difficult for me to stay in shape. I weigh what I weighed when I graduated from college more than 50 years ago. I have the same size waist. I wear the same size Levi's, 32, 34s. And while I ripped up my shoulder last year, a year ago right now, I've always taken pride in being able to do my age in push-ups. I work out when I'm on land three times a week, and that routine is to do, the first set is to do my age in push-ups and crunches, and then the second set I do 40 more of each of them, etc. And when I ripped my left shoulder rotator cuff, which I did probably in September of last year, but I only had it checked out when it didn't get better after a couple of months, and I got back here. A year ago right now I could do 0 push-ups, but after about 4 months with physical therapy and then getting back on my little boat, which is on a mooring in New Zealand, and I row back and forth to the shore, and I think that's among the best exercises. So I can again do my age in push-ups, which I have to add one every November. And there's a neat story, which a guy who reads some of my stuff sent me an email, and he recently went to Europe with his girlfriend, a new girlfriend, and he's only in his 30s, and they're in their hotel room, and he's doing push-ups, and she says, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm doing Webb Chiles' age in push-ups." So he does my age in push-ups because to do his age in push-ups isn't enough. And this is kind of an ultimate compliment. That pleases me. But if that's a lesson learned, maybe, and get yourself in shape as well as get your boat in shape. On that first circumnavigation, that 37-foot boat I was at sea for 5 months, almost 5 months, October 18th of 75 to March the 16th of 76. San Diego, around the Horn, south of Africa, south of Australia, up across the Tasman into New Zealand, because the boat was sinking out from under me and the sails were torn and I needed repairs. That boat was capsized 3 times in storms. I was you measure storms by the Beaufort scale. Force 12 begins at, I think, 64 knots and goes up indefinitely. And so I was in Force 12 storms in that boat 4 different times. The boat was capsized, mast down like this and back up. Those were all down in the Southern Ocean. Well, the last time was in the Tasman when I had to come just above 40 south and was hit by a cyclone. Those were difficult. When I was adrift in the open boat, which you, Lauren, might have missed when she pitchbowled in the Pacific for 14 days, that was difficult in the sense that I had limited supplies. I thought from the very beginning that I would reach land. I was in the trade winds that I'd reach land in 14 days, and in fact, that's exactly when I did reach land. But if I'd missed those islands, what's now Vanuatu, the next land beyond that was Australia, which was another 1,400 miles. So from the very beginning, I was trying to stay alive not just for 2 weeks, but for 3 months. And that was a difficult time. My present voyage is difficult in a different kind of a way. This boat is, the motion is very quick. I don't get seasick, but on this, I've never before, after finishing a passage, even that one of 5 months, stepped ashore and had a feeling of the land moving. On this little boat, even after a 3-day passage, I step ashore, and because the motion is so quick, she's so light, only 2,000 pounds, and the motion is, I step ashore and things are moving around for a while. This boat also doesn't, when I sit, the only place I can sit upright on it is on the cabin sole. And I have only about this much room between that and the overhead. And I can reach everything from that point, but you're still exposed very much. Some water leaks in, and it's difficult in terms of those limitations. I was in a gale in this boat as I approached New Zealand again in would have been September of 2014, and I'm blind in this eye for the last about 4 or 5 years due to glaucoma, and in this gale the waves are coming from over there, and I had to hand steer the last 10 hours or so to get in, and about 10 to 12 foot breaking waves that were cold, but they're coming from my blind side. I mean, I'm literally being blindsided, and sometimes they smashed into me, and the little boat would heel so far that while sitting down in the cockpit, I would be then almost standing up, looking straight down at the water. I have a safety harness on, but I couldn't leave the tiller long enough to go below to get it, and all my tiller pilots, I had 4 tiller pilots on the boat, they had all died by then. So I managed to take a sail tie and wrap it around my wrist and tie it into the tow rail, kind of like a hand strap on a subway building, a subway train, you know, kind of thing. Anyways, tied in like this, so that unless I ripped my whole arm off, at least I wasn't going to go overboard. Well, that's just part of the voyage.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, when you were first gaining your knowledge that made you feel confident enough to do a circumnavigation, do you have any tips for, or were you just mostly self-taught, or I imagine you learned a lot from other sailors, but you must have learned fairly quickly, no?
No, I didn't learn from other sailors. I mean, you chose parents who knew how to sail. I made a bad choice of parents, but I generally learned things best by myself. I mean, I did okay in school. I was a philosophy major, and I was accepted at all the grad schools I applied to. I didn't really want to teach, but this was back during Vietnam, and I went to school until the government decided what they wanted to do with my body, and when they decided they didn't want me, I went on with my life. So I did okay in school, but I never liked school. So I learned from books and some magazine articles, and buying my first boat, and I was up in San Francisco and going out and sailing it. The first time, I had only been on sailboats maybe 4 or 5 times at all before I bought my first boat. The first time I ever sailed alone on a boat was when I took delivery of that in Jack London Square in Oakland and sailed it around to Berkeley, where I had arranged for a slip. And so I taught myself. If people are... again, the woman who's then a part of my life, I liked San Francisco, but I like San Diego better as far as living there. I like the climate better. And so I got that boat in January, and in late August, over the labor, we took some vacation time. We worked for different people, but well, she quit. I was able to transfer. Anyway, we sailed that boat down to San Diego with a stop in Santa Barbara, and then I lived aboard down in San Diego. San Diego, you're in Los Angeles, Southern California, I mean, you're maybe getting El Nino storms this year, but this is a freak year. And but you get 2 or 3 winter storms normally in Southern California a year. I made a point of sailing in bad weather, such as there was in Southern California back then. And I think that's important to do if you can. Before I left on my first circumnavigation, I made a 500-mile trip from San Diego, a nonstop sail from San Diego down around Mexico's Guadalupe Island and back, which gives you different points of sail. You're reaching as you go down. You're generally beating against the wind as you come back. The winds off of that coast are mostly out of the northwest. But that was the longest I had sailed before I set out. People often say I have courage, something I've always denied except for, this is a bit political, maybe I do have courage because I'm not hysterical about terrorists, and most of our fellow countrymen at the moment seem to be hysterical about terrorists. But I don't claim to have courage about going to sea. What I do have is nerve, and courage is doing something you're afraid to do. Nerve is doing something that after you prepare yourself and your boat or your equipment, whatever it is, if you're mountain climbing, to the best of your knowledge and resources, you're still willing to embark on an endeavor the outcome of which is uncertain and might be fatal. That's nerve, and I have nerve. I don't have courage about sailing boats across oceans because I'm not afraid to do it. And but that 500-mile passage that I made down solo around Guadalupe Island was the longest I had ever sailed offshore before I set off on my first circumnavigation.
Of your books, which are you most proud of? Which deals more with technical issues, and which is more just an interesting story? What are your feelings on your 7 different books?
Well, the one that sells best, and always has, was the first one. And that's not a good career arc. But that Storm Passage, which is about that first circumnavigation, I reread it myself a few months ago because this is 40 years from when part of that experience took place. As I say, it's the one that sells best. It's the one that I am most tempted to rewrite when I read it because it is, in some ways, more brash than I probably am in my old age. But it's true to what I was then, and so I've let it stand. It is in my mind to maybe issue a revised Kindle edition sometime, but it won't be in the near future because this year I'm going to be at sea a lot of the rest of this year, and for many months. I don't, by and large, write technical pieces. My website is called Self-Portrait in the Present Sea, and my books are all about the voyages. They're about the experiences of the voyages. Some of them are about the land and the places, but a lot of the times my books are about sailing and the experience of being alone at what I call the monastery of the sea. The open boat, there are 2 books about the open boat. Those, I think, are probably of interest to a lot of people because I think they stretch people's imagination of what is possible.
Webb, what has been the biggest adventure? Being imprisoned as a spy or being married for 6 times? And by the way, which was your secret? Which was, by the way, your secret with women? Because it seems like you have been quite successful. Which was your secret?
Well, there's no secret there. Being locked up in Saudi Arabia was the most despairing experience of my life. It came. Which
was the accused?
I'm sorry, I missed that.
Which was the accused with which you were imprisoned?
Oh, I was sailing that little open boat up the Red Sea, and it was a bad year for me in the sense that my grandmother, my father's mother, who was the relative I was closest to, died earlier that year in San Diego, while I had sailed that open boat nonstop from Singapore to Aden. and went into Aden. That's at 4,000 miles, and as far as I know, that's the longest single open boat passage ever made. And in Aden, which is now part of Yemen, and then it was South Yemen and a radical communist country, I was able to make a phone call from this shack out in the desert back to San Diego and learned that my grandmother was dying of cancer. But I couldn't leave the boat there, and so I sailed up to Port Sudan, and I had bad weather in the Red Sea, and a storm and then a calm, and it took me 2 weeks to get there, and by the time I did, she had died. And I left the little boat there. I was her only living relative. And I flew all the way back and took care of some things, and actually a marriage came apart at that time as well. So I went back to Port Sudan in probably late May, started sailing up the Red Sea. Back then you navigated with sextants, and there is so much refraction off the desert, so much heat, that sextant sights are very distorted. You could take a noon sight, you could bring the sun down to the south, you could bring the sun down to the north. And with a sextant, if you could make a circle of probability of your position that had a 5-mile diameter, that was good. That does seem outrageous in the days of GPS when you're dealing with a meter or two. But when you think about it, most sailboats are only moving at 5, 6, 7 knots, and so that only means paying attention when you're near land for an extra hour, and you should be doing that anyway. The point is that my position was uncertain. At night, that I ran into an uncharted bit of coral offshore, bent the rudder on that boat. I actually carried a spare rudder. It's a very simple boat, and the rudder was a piece of steel welded to another piece of steel that lifted straight up through a slot. But it was bent enough I couldn't lift it up. So I went in toward the shore, saw some buildings, anchored, and it is an international law that ships in trouble can go into a harbor for emergency repairs. But I happened to go ashore into a place called Rabeck, which is about 100 miles north of Jeddah, on the day in 1982 that Israel went into Lebanon. And while the Arabs were once great sailors, they aren't anymore. And it was, I could not have been more strange if I had dropped from Mars. And they locked me up, and then they hid me from the American consul. I was not physically mistreated. I was being interrogated by a Saudi prince who, oddly, was a graduate of the University of Illinois and had a broader Midwestern accent than I. They did show me a canister with some Russian markings on it that they said was a bomb and had been taken off my boat, and I said it was not. They asked me to sign a confession that was in Arabic, a statement that was in Arabic, and I did, but I wrote that I'm signing something I can't read. And anyway, I was in a cell about 12 by 12 with a high ceiling, unair conditioned, a steel door, a steel plate over the window in Arabia in June, which was obviously rather hot. And I didn't know when I would get out until really the very morning I got out. And so that was a despairing experience. I've been married to my present wife for 21 years. She doesn't like to hear about the other women in my life, so I'm not going to talk about them.
Okay. Well, that's
as far as, I guess you made a decision in the 70s to never work for anyone else again. Is that correct?
It is correct. I have not worked for anybody else since 1974. I haven't owed any money since 1974. I have no credit rating. I tried to get a United. I have a frequent flyer mileage thing with United Airlines, who are linked to Air New Zealand. They send me these things, for their cards, which give you, among other things, priority boarding. And I'm quite willing to. Well, I didn't want the credit card. I was quite willing to pay them for the card just to get the priority boarding. But I don't have a credit rating. I don't exist. My wife has a credit rating. My wife is a productive member of society, an architect. But she could sign for me, but that would be like having your mother sign for you as a teenager, and so no, I'm just not going to do that. But yeah, there are databases in which I do not exist.
And so, what type of work have you done independently to pay for all of these trips?
We've already talked about it. I'm a writer. There are 7 books. There have been hundreds, I have no idea how many magazine articles. My stuff has been published translated into some foreign languages, and published on every continent except for South America and Antarctica, and I don't have much hope for Antarctica.
What is it so special about the sea and the oceans that you find there that you can find on the land? What do you think about the modern times, what's happening in the world, in politics? What's your vision about the world today? Is it optimistic, pessimistic? Is there something in the sea that is more special that brings you there?
Well, I have referred to it as entering the monastery of the sea. A week ago, my wife and I were in the Outer Banks of North Carolina at Kill Devil's Hills, in a condo right on the ocean, and met a man who has read my stuff, a fellow sailor who was there, and he asked me a similar question about what I liked about making ocean passages, and the first words came to mind were the purity of the experience. They're beyond the politics. When you look out, when you're in a city and you look out, as I look out these windows, I mean, it's filled with visual clutter and ugliness, frankly. There is beauty in cities, but you have to focus in on it. Beauty in a city is an oasis, and it's usually small. And if you're taking a photograph, for example, you're always having to try to avoid the clutter in the background, the wires, the cars, the billboards, all of it. I've often thought that, well, when I was in college, I wondered at the name of our species, Homo sapiens. What's it mean? Well, the Latin is wise or knowing man, and I thought immediately what a joke that is. I mean, this is self-deception on a massive scale. We are not Homo sapiens, we are Homo incipiens, which is foolish or unknowing man. But we came from the sea, and I have a hypothesis that those species, such as the dolphins and the whales who came ashore, decided it was a bad deal, and went back, they're really shown the intelligence. When I reread Storm Passage, I made the observation then, on Christmas of 1975, I was in the South Atlantic, a couple of weeks past Cape Horn, and rounding Cape Horn that first time was one of the seminal events of my life. It was something I'd wanted to do for a long time. As we've already said, you can think you're special, but until you really accomplish something, it's irrelevant. Everybody thinks they're special. And so I was in the South Atlantic, and I had a radio. Back then, to do celestial navigation, you need to have time precisely. And you should get time ticks. You could get them from the BBC. You could get them from a couple of signals that the United States government sends out. And what you used back then, most people used, was a thing called a zenith transoceanic radio, which was a thing about yay big, used 9 D cells. And but I also was listening to radio, and on Christmas Day, maybe it's Christmas Eve, maybe it's Christmas night, I could get radio from Radio South Africa, the BBC, the Voice of America, some things in South America, and I could hear music, but I could hear the news, and I remember thinking how the news of the land didn't even seem as though it was on the same planet with me. I was in a completely different world, and that's still true today. What I've said about society, somebody once at a lecture I gave asked me about what I thought about American society and where it was, and what I said was, what I want from society is that it be stable enough so that I can find the edge and live there, and I guess that's still the way I feel. I don't have a solution for America's problems. I I think I've spent a lot of time in the Commonwealth, and I think that they do elections a hell of a lot better than we do. I mean, they call an election, or it comes up, and when a parliament runs out, they campaign for 6 weeks, and it's over. In America, it's been going on for a half a year already, and it's going to go on more, and I'm very grateful that I'm going to be at sea during most of it.
Good answer. I agree.
And how is it going to be this next circumnavigation? You're going to do it solo or with someone else?
Oh, no, this is solo. This boat is really small. My wife sailed with me on part of my fourth circumnavigation. We lived, before we moved here 10 years ago in March, we lived in Boston, where she went to school, graduate school, and continued working there for a while. And in 2001, I've twice had 5-year plans to free myself from the land. Once was back in the late 60s through 74. Again, we were in Boston. We had a 5-year plan to go sailing, and so she sailed with me on that 37-foot boat that we lived aboard in Boston for 4 of those 5 years before we left, and sailed across the Atlantic, down to Africa, across to Brazil, back to South Africa. She is a good sailor, but she did not like the ocean passages and preferred to go back to work. However, this little boat is really small. If you go to my website, you can see photographs. It has the beam is roughly the stretch of my arms. I mean, it's about 7 feet 2 inches, a little more than my arm stretch. As I say, down below, I can barely sit upright. It has a very quick motion. It is totally exposed up on deck, and she does not like sailing on this boat. So yeah, this is a solo circumnavigation completely, and I started in San Diego. I crossed the Pacific in '74. I left in San Diego in, I think, in May. It might have been early June. I went out to Hilo, Hawaii, then to Honolulu, then down to Samoa, and Tonga and New Zealand. 4 stops along the way. This year I will sail across. The cyclone season is on in the South Pacific right now. It ends about May 1st. I'll sail across to Australia, up around the top end around Cape York. My favorite coastal sail in the world is from Cairns inside the Great Barrier Reef up to Cape York. There are good anchorages inside the reef most of the way, and there's nothing up there. I wrote an article about it once called "The Big Empty" because there are no people to speak of, and I like it up there. Across to Darwin, and then out maybe to Cocos, which is islands, which are still a part of Australia, maybe Mauritius, and then South Africa. That's about 10,000 nautical miles. And I should be in South Africa by October, roughly. And depending on what shape the boat and I are in, I'll decide how quickly to press on after that. When you sail around the world, barring the northwest and the northeast passages, north of North America and Asia, both of which are becoming easier to do with global warming, you either go north or south of South America, Africa, Australia. You either go east or west. Well, I've done all those permutations. On this voyage, from South Africa, I will go up to Namibia, which I visited once in maybe 1988. A few boats stopped there. And then out to St. Helena, which I also visited that year. That's where Napoleon was held in his last captivity and died. At St. Helena, I'll decide whether to go northwest and through Panama, or, excuse me, northwest to Panama, or southwest down to the Falklands and try Cape Horn from the east. That's more difficult. Nobody's ever attempted that in the kind of little boat I have. It'll be cold and wet, and I don't know if it's possible, and maybe that's part of the interest that I have in it, that I don't know that it's possible. And I've been buying equipment that will prepare me to do that if I go that way, including I just bought a dry suit. I have foul weather gear, but I haven't had a dry suit before, and so I have one of those, and I'm making the preparations that will enable me to go that way if I make that decision.
What have some of your biggest surprises been on these long voyages in small boats, either positive or negative things that came up that you didn't expect?
I don't have a quick answer to that. I don't recall being surprised at anything in particular. I remember certain incidents in that little boat, the open boat. I'm sailing. I sailed from Singapore, and I had planned to stop possibly in Sri Lanka, but I made it across fairly quickly, and I decided to keep on going. And if you picture in the world, you know, India and Sri Lanka hanging off of it like a teardrop, I'm south of that, well offshore, and that boat, I mean, you never go down below. There's no place to go down below. You just lie down on the floorboards. I used to sleep, I pulled a tarpaulin up over myself, and often I slept in foul weather gear. But I was sitting on that boat, and I'm hundreds of miles out at sea, and all of a sudden, I see right ahead of me white water as though it's a rock. And I thought, what in the hell can that be? And I grabbed the tiller. I used cheat to tiller self-steering on that boat, but I grabbed it and bore off, and it was a whale right in front of me that hadn't seen me coming, and I hadn't seen him coming, and he was bigger than I was, and I certainly would have gotten the worst of it. But as far as in terms of the experiences, it was what I expected. It was difficult. Some of it was difficult. There's great beauty out there. There's great joy, even on the open boat, and certainly on Gannet, which is the name of my present boat. And there is great pleasure in any boat when you've got the boat moving as well as it can move. I mean, this isn't racing where you're trying to get the last hundredth of a knot out of it, but the boat is in a groove. It's moving along. There's great pleasure in that, and as I say, there's beauty out there, even in the emptiness. People often ask me about what I see out there, and I actually see, and I read that there are probably good reasons for that. I think I see fewer fish and fewer birds out there than I did 40 years ago, and I rather think that we, as a species, are responsible.
Did you have any other particular questions, Paolo, or maybe Webb, if you had any?
No, I'm still very impressed. I mean, I just want to say that there are many people my age in their mid-30s, and they say, I am too old to do this. So it's really impressive to listen to someone like you who is still planning to do these things. And it's really inspirational, no? What would you say to those people who say that they are too old in their 30s and 40s?
Well, my response, an immediate thought was, if they say they're too old, they probably are. If they think they're too old, they probably are. But objectively, they aren't too old. There's a song by a female singer, it escapes me right now who sings it, but something about some people say you shouldn't tempt fate, and for them I agree. But as for myself, I say fate shouldn't try to tempt me. Well, if people, to say that anything is possible and to say that age is just a number is frankly stupid, and that's Disney thinking. I mean, it's just not so. There are many things that aren't possible, and there are limitations that people cannot overcome. I spent a lot of time in third world countries, and I think probably one of the great losses are probably people with significant talent, great talent, who are born into situations from which there is almost no escape. And Americans, even poor Americans, probably can't imagine those situations, but I've seen them. But within the acceptance that there are limitations, I still think that a great many limitations maybe are self-imposed. And if you don't impose those limitations on yourself, you can do a hell of a lot more than maybe most people think you can. If you don't think you can, you can't. But if you think you can, I never planned to be a poster child or poster childs for growing old, but you know, you don't have to stop doing what you love unless you are really smashed by time and chance. And most people move toward retirement. As I say, I don't believe in retirement, and I don't think my boss is going to fire me.
So you don't plan to stop sailing anytime soon, I guess?
No, I do not. It creates problems in that I regret that I have to leave my wife alone for long periods of time. But we met when I was 50 years old or 52 or something. I mean, there was truth in advertising. I mean, it wasn't that she met some... I mean, my first wife, we were in college, and I wanted to do what I wanted to do. But we were in college here in the Midwest. I had never sailed a boat. So she was perhaps thinking, well, he's going to grow out of it. But my present wife, we met, as I say, when I had already been doing this for 20 years or so. And if, for example, I'm blind in this eye, if what happened to this eye, or excuse me, what happened to this eye happens to this eye, I'm through sailing. I'm sitting here patting my seeing eye dog on the head. But if those kinds of things don't happen, I will keep on sailing, I hope, for a long time to come.
I wish you will. I think
you.
you will.
Yeah, you're quite an inspiration, and I think it's been a great interview. I thank you again.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you very much for talking with us.
My pleasure. I wish you guys all the best.
We will check your blog to check how your adventure will be in March 1st, no? You will go to New Zealand.
I will go to New Zealand. The flight is to New Zealand on March the 1st. I'm going to correct you on something. I find blog a really ugly word. And I
have a blog.
So I don't have a blog. I have a website, and on the website there's a journal, which I kept long before there was an internet. And I have kept a journal for both. It's an aid as a writer. It's an aid for memory. You can. I also had the title of that. I kept that title in Self-Portrait in the Present Sea. I had that title in mind for decades before I found something to do with it, and I put it on the website. It's there. There's a lot of information there. I'm not into self-promotion. People get it or they don't, and that's okay with me. But it's there. There are a lot of photographs. There's a lot of information. Some of it is technical, and it might be of use to people who want to go sailing. But I have more interest in sailing alone. I'm there on March the 1st, and I'll be sailing about May the 1st. I carry what's called a yellow brick, which is a tracking device that sends up signals to satellites. It then goes to, I think, to a place in England, which is where yellow bricks are made, and they stick them on a tracking page, which is available on the web, and so people can follow my track out there. I did this originally just so that my wife could know where I was, but that tracking page is available to the general public, and you can follow along there if you want to.
It's interesting. Maybe we will check it.
Do you find with the internet now that you get kind of more followers or fewer just because people are overwhelmed with so much other information? And as far as writing or making a living as a writer, I hear that it's harder nowadays with so much being published to get following as a writer. Have you noticed one way or the other?
Well, what I have, I am completely happy with the internet and with ebooks. As a matter of fact, I have, I have a standard iPhone, an iPhone 6, and it is amazing that on this thing there are maybe 400 books and 600 music albums, because I can't keep stuff in the cloud. I'm not always connected. But I'm certainly connected back here, and I make more money from the Kindle editions of my books than I do from the paper editions. So I actually prefer ebooks, all the rest. What I've noticed, of course, is because I still write for some magazines. The magazines, print magazines, there is much less opportunity for somebody to break in as I did 40 years ago. I mean, there's just less content, and that would be harder to do. There are some online sites, but I doubt that they pay very much. And so that part is difficult. The internet has connected me with a great many people all over the world that I would not otherwise have known, and who are interested in what I do, who seem to understand what I do. I can't say that nobody understands me. I think a lot of people understand me. I think that it is not, there are a lot of people who don't, but yeah, it has changed the writing part in some ways, but that you can make these contacts, and I hear from a lot of people in a lot of places that I never would have otherwise. I think it's just fantastic. I assume that people who are young, and I mean under 20 or even in their 20s, takes maybe the people around their 20s who always lived with this, take it all for granted. But for me, that I can see a book reviewed and press a button and have it on my phone 2 minutes later is a continued source of amazement and pleasure.
And we're certainly glad that it lets us talk to you. So thank you again.
Okay, my pleasure.
Thank you very much. Have a nice next adventure.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.